whatever, but it's not an issue of security. Israel is much more insecure trying to hold a hostile population inside it than it would be under a political settlement which would reduce tensions and leave a demilitarized Palestinian state on its borders contained within a hostile Israeli-Jordanian military alliance. Whatever the issue may be, it's not security, nor is it the PLO covenant. The PLO, in my view, should withdraw the covenant, but in 1977 it already announced that the covenant would have no consequences for interstate relations, any more than statements of the Zionist organization do. Israel was stated that the PLO in the covenant is dedicated to the destruction of Israel. Yes, but they've said that it doesn't affect interstate relations. However, Israel is dedicated to the destruction of Palestinian nationalism, and it implements that dedication. Furthermore, quite apart from the actions, the official documents of the Zionist movement up until today still call for that. In fact, they even call, like for example, the governing Likud party has repeatedly, again a few weeks ago, announced that its claims to Jordan remain in place. It has not abandoned its claims to Jordan. David Ben-Gurion and Chaim Weizmann, back at the time of partition, all the way back, in fact, repeatedly made it clear that there are no, as David Ben-Gurion put it, the bounds of Zionist aspirations cannot be controlled by any foreign element. They will be determined by what we do. As the 1949 war was continuing, he stated that we will not establish borders because we will determine the borders by our own actions.
Professor Chomsky, let me break in at that point.
Okay.
And there are a couple of things I'd like to pull out of Professor Chomsky's remarks and ask you, Mr. Perle. The first one that he formed as a kind of a question is, what should we expect with regards to Nicaragua when, as we did in 1985, engage in a blockade and, in effect, engage in aggressive actions against Nicaragua? Did we not push them into looking to the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe for assistance?
Well, I believe that Nicaragua was already not only looking to the Soviet Union for assistance, but receiving it, and receiving it on a sizable scale, using equipment received from the Soviet Union and from Cuba in El Salvador in order to try to produce a change of government in El Salvador. We started out, the Carter administration started out. Some of us were a little dubious about that policy, but nevertheless it started out well disposed toward the new Sandinista administration. I think that's undeniable. Its attitude toward the Sandinistas began to change when it became evident that the Sandinistas were not putting in place the sort of democratic administration that one had expected, and indeed that a number of the Contra leaders, for that reason, ultimately left the Sandinista leadership and decided, and this must have been a bitter disappointment, that they would again have to take up arms in order to attempt to realize their ambitions for the democratization of Nicaragua. And what we have in Nicaragua today is a police state. I don't think there's any question about that. I don't see any likelihood that it's going to change. But what I found most peculiar about Professor Chomsky's view, and perhaps he'd care to say more about it, is why he believes it is in the interest of the United States to drive Nicaragua into the arms of the Soviet Union, since he believes that that's what we did. As one listens to Professor Chomsky, I think one can only come to the conclusion that the United States is led and has been led for the last 40 years by people who haven't the slightest idea of how to promote their own intelligent interests.
Oh, no.
Because as he describes both our policies which he derives from documents, and I can only repeat that unless I'm mistaken, you've never served in government, because anyone who would attempt to derive the conclusions you do from the kinds of documents you've been reading simply doesn't understand what it means to formulate policy in a real government.
Well, your question was...
If you accept the general thrust of Professor Chomsky's view, then I think you have to come to the conclusion that the leadership of the United States for the last 40 years has acted contrary to the interests that he says they had established as their principal interest. That was the prosperity of the United States in a world of liberal internationalism. I happen to think liberal internationalism is a pretty good thing, and Professor Chomsky obviously doesn't. I believe it is conducive to the prosperity of the United States and to the prosperity of the world, broadly speaking. Professor Chomsky is troubled by the fact that Honduras exports snow peas. He's mentioned it twice. I presume they export snow peas because there's a market abroad for snow peas, and it seems to me, on the whole, a good thing for countries that are able to produce and export and earn income thereby to do so. The fact that there is poverty in Honduras is not an argument against building up Honduran export industries. I don't know what that bell is meant to signify.
Maybe that's time for me to...
Well, it is true that the Palestinians have made it a part of their covenant that Israel has no legitimate right to exist as a Jewish state in Palestine, and if it were up to him, he would change that, and while they haven't changed it, they've sort of disavowed it, and so we mustn't take it too seriously. I do think that misses the point. There is a reason why the PLO has not revised its covenant to change that provision, and the reason is that it would tear the PLO apart if they attempted to do so, because a significant element within the Palestine Liberation Organization is dedicated to the destruction of a Jewish state in Palestine. I don't know where Professor Chomsky stands on the existence of a Jewish state in Palestine. I happen to believe that it is right and proper that there should be a Jewish state in Palestine. I am not, as a consequence of that, unsympathetic to the situation of the Palestinians, but a solution, when one is found, has to be one that guarantees some reasonable security for the Israelis after what the Israelis have been through. And as you look at the turbulence in the Middle East, it seems to me understandable that any Israeli government would want to move with extreme caution in concluding agreements that entail a significant sacrifice in terms of physical security, that is, by giving up territory that acts as a buffer in exchange for promises originating with an organization that remains dedicated to Israel's destruction.
Professor Chomsky, did you wish to
Well, I was
respond?
asked, several questions came up. Let me deal with them one at a time. Why is it in the interest of the United States to drive Nicaragua into the hands of the Soviet Union? That's transparent, actually. First, let's establish again that was the policy of the United States. Simply to review the record, the Carter administration tried very hard to, first of all, it supported Somoza until virtually the end, long after the Nicaraguan business community, our natural allies, turned against him, and after our other Central American allies turned against him. When it became impossible to support Somoza, because he was obviously gone, the Carter administration tried to maintain the National Guard in power. In fact, it called upon the Organization of American States to intervene to maintain the National Guard in power in a policy that Latin Americans called Somocismo without Somoza. That failed. The Latin American countries refused to go along. After that, the Carter administration tried in every way to rescue the National Guard. So, for example, they sent American planes under Red Cross marking, it's a violation of the laws of war, incidentally, into Managua to take National Guard officers out. The Contras were reconstituted on the border. They were quickly picked up by the Reagan administration and turned into a terrorist force to attack Nicaragua. Meanwhile, the Carter administration offered aid, but not to the Sandinista government. Let me repeat that. That aid went to the private sector. It was, again, a last-ditch effort to try to prevent the Sandinistas from coming into power. Now, maybe the Carter administration would have made some arrangement. We can't tell. But when the Reagan administration came in, that was finished. They launched an attack against Nicaragua almost immediately, both a military attack and an economic attack. They prevented our allies from sending aid to Nicaragua. So, for example, there was pressure put on France to stop them from providing arms. The story about arms in El Salvador, I'll go into it if you like, but there's nothing to it. Both economic warfare and military warfare increased. International